The Edge Chronicles, Beyond the Deep Woods, by Paul Stewart and Chris Riddle, read by P. Waitonick. Chapter 5. The Bloodoak. At first it was just a tickle, which Twig swatted away in his sleep. He smacked his lips drowsily and rolled over onto his side. Nestling in his cot of leaves beneath the ancient spreading tree, Twig looked so young and small and vulnerable. A long, thin, squirmy creature was doing the tickling. As Twig's breathing grew more regular once again, it wriggled around in mid-air directly in front of his face. It flexed and writhed in the warm air each time Twig breathed out. All at once, it darted forwards and began probing the skin around the boy's mouth. Twig grumbled sleepily, and his hand brushed at his lips. The squirmy creature dodged the slender fingers and scurried up into the dark tunnel of warmth above. Twig sat bolt upright, instantly wide awake. His heart pounded. There was something up his left nostril! He grabbed his nose and squeezed till his eyes watered. Abruptly, the whatever it was scraped down over the soft membrane inside his nose and was out. Twig winced, and his eyes screwed shut with pain. His heart pounded, all the more furiously. What was there? What could possibly it be? Fear and hunger wrestled with one another into the pit of Twig's stomach. Scarcely daring to look, Twig peered out through the crack in one eye. Catching sight of a flash emerald green, Twig feared the worst and scuttled back on his hands and feet. The next moment, he slipped, his legs shot out in front of him, and he came crashing down on his elbows. He stared back into the gloomy half-light of the new morning. The wriggly green creature had not moved. "I'm being silly," Twig muttered. "It's just a caterpillar." Leaning back, he squinted up into the dark canopy. Behind black leaves, the sky had turned from brown to red. The air was warm, but the backs of his legs were damp with the early morning moisture of the deep woods. It was time to make a move. Twig climbed to his feet and was brushing the twigs and leaves out of his hammelhorn skin waistcoat when... whoosh! The air hissed with a sound like a lashing whip. Twig gasped and stared in frozen horror as the emerald green caterpillar lunged at him and flew around his outstretched wrist once, twice, 3 times. "Ah!" he screamed as sharp thorns dug into his skin, and he cursed himself for letting his guard slip. For the wiggly green creature wasn't a caterpillar at all. It was a creeper, a tendril, the emerald tip of a long and viciously barbed vine that writhed and swayed through the shadowy forest like a serpent seeking out warm-blooded prey. Twig had been lassoed by the terrible Terry vine. "Let me go!" he cried, tugging frantically at the stout vine. "Let me go!" As he pulled so, the claw-like thorns punctured his skin and sank deep into the softness of his inner arm. Twig yelped with pain and watched, terrified, as tiny crimson beads of blood grew and burst and trickled down over his hand. A thick, sickly wind stirred his hair and ruffled the fur of his hammelhorn skin waistcoat. It carried the scent of his blood into the shadows. From out of the darkness came the soft clattering noise of 1,000 razor-sharp teeth gnashing impatiently. Then the wind changed and Twig gagged on the metallic stench of death. He bit into it, only to spit out the vile bitterness a moment later. He pulled, he prized, he tugged and tore at the vine. But it was too tough. He couldn't break its ferocious grip. He could not get free. Suddenly the vine gave a tremendous yank, and Twig was wrenched forwards. He spluttered as he landed with a thud on the forest floor, and his mouth was filled with the rich brown, loamy soil. It tasted of Tildermeat sausages. but rancid, sour. He retched emptily and spat again. "Stop!" Twig screamed, but the tarry vine paid him no heed. Over rocks and tree stumps, it dragged its victims, through wood nettles and tripweed, bumping, banging, crashing. Twig knew, however, that no matter how badly he was knocked and battered and stung, the worst was still to come. Passing a cumbutch, he clutched desperately at the branch and clung on for dear life. Where was the caterbird now that he needed him? For a moment, the vine snagged on some roots. A squeal of sudden fury echoed from the shadows, and the tarry vine sent a wave of whiplash rippling along its length. Twig gripped as tightly as he could onto the branches, but the vine was too strong. The bush sprang out of the ground, roots and all, and Twig found himself being bumped over the forest floor faster than ever. Below him now were hard, white, knobbly objects which dug into him as the tarry vine dragged him on. The further he went, the more there were. Twig gasped with sudden terror. They were bones, thigh bones, backbones, ribs, and empty grinning skulls. "No! No! No!" Twig screamed, but the air was dead, and his cries were snuffed out by the blood-red light. Jerking his head around, Twig peered into the shadows in front of him. He saw a tree trunk thick and rubbery that grew out of the whole white mound where the bones lay thickest. It pulsed and squealed. It glistened with sticky saliva which oozed from countless gaping suckers. From high above him, where the branches divided, Twig heard the gnashing of 1,000 mandible-like teeth as each one opened and shut noisily, greedily. Louder, and louder, and louder! It was the sound of the terrible flesh-eating Bloodoak. "My knife!" thought Twig feverishly as the clattering grew faster, the stench fouler, the squealing increasingly agitated. He fumbled around on his belt feverishly and gripped the smooth handle of his naming knife. Then, with one swift movement, he pulled it from its sheath, swung his arm over his head, and brought the blade down with all his strength. There was a sound of soggy splintering, and a spurt of glistening green slime squirted into his face. Yet, as his arm suddenly jerked back, Twig knew he'd done it. He wiped the slime from his eyes. Yes! There it was, the vine swaying hypnotically to fro and above him. Back and forwards it went, back and forwards, to and fro. Twig was rooted to the spot. He watched, transfixed, as the severed ends stopped dripping and the liquid congealed to form a knobbly green blob at the end of the vine, the size of his fist. Abruptly, the rubbery skin split, the blob burst open and, with a rasping slurp, a long tentacle tipped with emerald green sprang out. It sensed the air and quivered. Then a second tentacle appeared, and a third. Twig stared, unable to move. Where one vine had been, now there was 3. They reared up, ready to strike, and swoosh! All 3 of them lunged. Twig screamed with pain and terror as the tentacles lashed themselves tightly around his ankles. Then, before he could do anything about it, the tarry vine tugged his feet out from under him and hoisted him upside down, high up into the air. The whole forest blurred before Twig's eyes as the blood rushed to his head. It was all he could do to keep hold of his knife. Wriggling and squirming and grunting with effort, he heaved himself up and clung hold of the vine and began jabbing and stabbing. "For Sky's sake, let me go!" he cried. Green slime immediately began bubbling to the surface. It oozed round his knife and over his head, oily and slippery. Twig lost his grasp and tumbled back through the air. Dangling helplessly by his feet, he twisted his neck back and looked down. He was above the top of the main tree trunk. Directly beneath him were the 1,000 razor-sharp teeth he had heard clattering so greedily. Arranged in a wide circle, they glinted in the red light. All at once, they sprang open. Twig found himself staring down into the crimson gorge of the bloodthirsty tree. It slobbered and slavered noisily. The stench was atrocious. Twig gagged emptily. Now he would never ride the Sky Pirate's ships, nor reach his destiny, nor even leave the deep woods. With his last bit of strength, Twig struggled frantically to pull himself upwards again. The Hamelhorn skin waistcoat slipped down over his eyes. He felt the fur stiffen as he rubbed it the wrong way. Again and again, he reached up and finally, he managed to clutch hold of the vine. As he did so, it released his feet. Twig cried out with fear as he swung loose and dug in with his fingernails. Now, instead of trying to cut himself free, he was desperate to hold on, desperate not to be dropped down into the gaping mouth of the Bloodoak. Hand over hand, he tried to climb the vine, but, slippery with the slime, it slid back between his fingers. For every inch he went up, he slithered back half a dozen. "Help!" he whimpered softly. "Help me!" The vine gave a violent jerk. Twig lost his grip, and the tarry vine flicked him away. Feet first, arms flailing, he dropped through the air. He landed with a sickening squelch deep down inside the cavernous mouth of the flesh-eating Bloodoak. The teeth snapped shut above his head. It was a pitch black in the tree, and loud with the sound of hideous gurgling. "I can't move!" he gasped. All around him, the monstrous throat constricted, and rings of hard, woody muscle squeezed him tightly. "Can't breathe!" One thought went round and round his head, too awful to take in. "I'm being eaten alive!" Deeper and deeper down he went. Eaten alive! Suddenly the Bloodoak juddered. A rumbling, grumbling burbled up from the inner depths of the tree, and a blast of foul air rushed up past Twig. For an instant, the muscles released their grip. Twig gasped and slipped down a little further. The Hamelhorn skin waistcoat bristled as it was brushed up the wrong way. The Bloodoak juddered again. The gurgling grew louder as the Bloodoak continued to cough until the whole spongy tube shook with a deafening roar. Beneath him, Twig felt something strange pressing against the bottom of his feet, pushing him upwards. All at once, the retching tree released its grip on Twig's body for a second time. It had to get rid of the spiky object which had become lodged in its throat. It burped, and the pressure of air, which had built up below, suddenly exploded with such violence that it shot Twig back up the hollow trunk. He burst into the air with a loud pop and soared off in a shower of spittle and slime. And for a moment, Twig felt he was actually flying. Up and away he went, as free as a bird, and then down again, crashing through the branches as he hurtled back to the ground. He landed with a heavy thud that jarred every bone in his body. For a moment he lay there, scarcely daring to believe what had happened. "You saved my life," he said, smoothing the fur of the Hamelhorn skin waistcoat. "Thank you for your gift, Matadam." Hurt, but not that badly, it occurred to Twig that something must have broken his fall. It reached below him tentatively. "Oi!" a voice protested. Startled, Twig rolled over and looked up. Not something, but somebody. He tightened his grip on the knife, still in his hand. Well, that's it for this chapter. If you enjoyed this, please give it a like. If you'd like to see more, feel free to stick around and subscribe. Thanks for listening.